It's time for another Dirt Daily, and today's Dirt Daily is presented by OnX Off-Road. OnX Off-Road is a mapping app. You put it on your phone, and then you can find off-road trails. I use this app all the time when I'm either planning a trip or if I'm somewhere and I'm like, oh, where can we go four-wheeling that's nearby here? Plus, oftentimes when I'm driving and I see like some cool rock formation, I will put a little waypoint on my OnX, and then later on I can go back and kind of find out, is this public land or is this private land and who owns it or whatever. So today's project, I am back in the shop on the Flatfender. Everybody loves the Flatfender. I've kind of been ignoring it recently, doing some other projects, but I really want to get back to this thing because look at it, it's cool. So today we are going to start doing some wiring on the ignition. And by ignition, I don't mean this, though this is part of it. This is what a lot of you may consider ignition. This is the part that the key goes in and you turn it and makes the engine start. We're also going to look at the coil and the distributor, starter solenoid, basically all of the parts that interact when you turn this key and you want the engine to start. Is the engine going to start today on this episode? No promises. I'm not setting a goal that big because I don't want to ruin the episode if it doesn't happen. But maybe we'll get lucky by the end of this episode, or maybe we'll just have a bunch of boring wiring stuff. So let's get to work. So when we left off on the Flatfender, I think the last thing I figured out was the fuel pump. And I was able to get fuel pumping from a gas can through the fuel pump. So the fuel pump is kind of ready to be hooked up to the carburetor. Now, if you know anything about engines, you know that you need compression, you need fuel, and you need spark. Air, fuel, spark, and air needs to be compressed. Today, we're going to look at the spark side, and the spark side is what I kind of consider everything involved in the ignition system. That's the stuff that cranks over the engine, makes the spark, which lights the fuel inside the compression of the cylinder to make everything turn and the engine turn, and then the transmission turn and your wheels turn and you happily bounce down the trail. So, the last time, over the past few episodes on the Flatfender, I've kind of messed with things in this corner. I got the engine to crank over. I did pull the starter back out, so this will have to go back in. But before we dive into that, let's talk about the different components of the ignition system. I found this diagram online, and this is the diagram that I'm basically going to lay out in the Flatfender. There is the battery, which we already have in the Jeep. There's an ignition switch, which I showed you at the intro, and I will dive into that more and explain why we're going with that specific ignition switch. Then there is the starter and the starter solenoid. In this diagram, they're kind of looped together, but I actually have a starter solenoid that mounts on the fender instead of the one that is shown in the diagram that is part of the starter. There's a ballast resistor, the ignition coil. There's a fuse panel that will eventually be wired in, but we're definitely not getting to that today. And then there's the condenser and points, which are all part of the distributor. Most of these components live in this general area on the Flatfender. Battery sits right here, starter will go right down in there, coil, distributor, ballast resistor, and starter solenoid. All of these are basically living in this corner, which is pretty convenient because wiring is pretty simple, and other than running wires inside and under the dash to go to the ignition switch. Let's talk about this ignition switch. This ignition switch that I have in my hand is out of a CJ5. I found it in my pile of stuff from a 1970s, probably 72, 73 CJ5. And it's super simple, and I'm gonna use it. I tested it, it seems to all be working. It's kind of ratty looking, but I think it's gonna be just fine for what I wanna do. Now, how does the ignition switch work? Well, there's a key that you put into the ignition switch, and then when you turn the key clockwise one step, it's in the run position. And when you turn it clockwise a little bit more, you can feel a momentary switch, and that's the start position. So when you're sitting there ready to start the thing up, you turn it all the way to start, and the engine cranks over. Then when you let your hand off of it, it springs back to the run position. You want to turn the car off, turn it one notch counterclockwise, and that's in the off position. If you turn it another notch counterclockwise, that's the accessory position. And in that position, it sends power to the accessory port on the back of the ignition switch. Now, the back of the ignition switch has 4 terminals. There is one that says, and the cool thing is if you look at this closely, each terminal is labeled. I'm going to see if you can read this. Right up there beside this pin, right underneath my finger, it should say battery on either side, B-A-T. Can you read that? I'm going to move it in and out so it focuses. Then, right in the middle, there's a terminal, and right here by this finger, you can see ST. That's start. Then there's one over here, and you'll see on either side of this one, ACC. That should be accessory. And then this one, there's another terminal, and on either side it says IGN for ignition. So, how does this work? Well, when you hook this up to start, you send 12 volts to the battery terminal. Pretty basic. When you turn the key all the way to that start position, it sends power out the middle one to the start solenoid. When it springs back to the run position, it's sending power to both ignition and accessory. So the accessory wires over to your fuse panel, and it only is wired into things that you want that will turn on with the key in the accessory position. So you'll have certain things that will turn on all the time. Headlights, brake lights. Then you'll have things that will only turn on in the accessory position. And on a Flatfender, that would be maybe gauges, maybe like your fuel gauge, things that you would only need running. There's really not much on a Flatfender that you would need running with the accessory position. You might have a power outlet if you put one in. You might have, I was going to say reverse lights, but the Flatfender doesn't have that. Radio, Flatfender doesn't have that. So basically, most of the accessory stuff we're not even going to worry about. So that's kind of down the road. Right now, what we want to worry about is ignition, start, and battery. And we'll probably put a wire on the accessory and run that up to where we'll put a fuse box at some point, but for now it's just going to be a dead wire hanging out. But it's nice to get all the wires on this and then reach up underneath the dash and get it mounted. So we need a biggish wire running from the battery positive terminal to this battery terminal. And we'll probably want to put a fuse in line with that. And then we're going to run a signal wire from the start terminal in the middle here, and that'll go to the starter solenoid. And then we will have the ignition wire from this ignition terminal here, and that will run to your coil. But that's kind of down the road. But basically for now, we're going to lay out some wires on this. If you look in an old Jeep manual, you can probably find the exact colors that they used. I don't know if it'll say for 46, but you might be able to find the colors for like a 70s Jeep and match those if you care. But don't do like I've seen done before, where you just buy a giant spool of red wire and you use that for everything, because you're just asking for confusion. So I would probably say big red wire for battery, maybe orange signal wire for start, and then, I don't know, blue or pink or something else for ignition. And then accessory can be whatever's left over, green, beige, purple. All right, let's wire this up. There are a lot of different ways that you can wire up your ignition switch. This is what I have come up with. which is pretty clean. I have a big red wire coming in there for the battery terminal. I have a blue wire that will run off to a fuse panel. There's a yellow wire for the ignition, and then green for go on the start terminal. I've tested this, and then I tested it after I hooked it up. I basically took my power probe and I put ground to the red wire, and then tested all of the other ends of the other wires when the key was in the appropriate position. I set it up like this, but I'm going to put a fuse panel in the Jeep to run all of the electrical accessories. There will be a full-time power side on the fuse panel, and then there will be a keyed side on the fuse panel. And the way it will work is stuff like headlights and brake lights will be on the full-time side, and then other stuff like gauges will be on the accessory side, so that they only come on when the key is on accessory or on run. Now, some people will wire up starter switches like this, and they will put everything on these terminals. So if any of their accessories need power when the key is to add accessory, they'll just hook up a whole bunch of stuff to this. I think this is kind of messy, plus like there's a ton of red wires, which is not really easy to diagnose. I don't know what this was on. This is probably a great ignition switch, but I just dug that out of my tool bag, and that's something that I don't like to see. I would rather have the wires go. I mean, I swear, I'm not the best electrical guy. You've probably seen in my other projects, but I try to keep it as clean and organized as possible, and I try not to overuse one color of wire. Here is another key that I had in my electrical box where everything goes into this plug. This is pretty convenient because then you can just unplug this, and then the back of the switch is ready to just plug in. You just wire everything. You can mount this, and then you reach up in there and plug it in. The tricky part about this is that I wired everything, and now I'm going to put it up underneath the dash, and if I ever have to remove it and it's all wired in, it can be a little bit difficult to do. That brings up the question of where do you put this on the dash? Now, over on the passenger side is where the keyed ignition originally was. And that key actually ran a coil. Your ignition coil was mounted on the inside of the dash. And then down on the floor was a push button for the start. And it actually went through the floor and right onto the starter and was like, hey, starter, start cranking. So you would turn that key and then you'd push that button. I've actually talked to people and they say that the push button starter on the floor kind of makes it, like they're not the best starters. Maybe the older ones were, but the newer ones, the ones you can get nowadays aren't that great. So I decided to go with this setup. Now I need a hole to mount it in. This has holes and buttons and stuff all over the dash, but right here behind the steering column on the driver's side, there's a hole that I guess was originally for the governor control. So that would help control like how fast the engine was revving. I am going to use that hole because I don't have a governor control on this, and because it should be convenient where when you're the driver, if you say you have a seatbelt on, you can reach on there and grab it, where over there on that side, it's a little bit farther out of reach. So Flatfenders didn't have seatbelts, but I think it's probably a good idea to put one in. So I am going to feed this up inside there and then route all of this wire loom across and then find a hole in the firewall to poke out so that then we have wiring on the engine bay side of the firewall, and then we can start figuring out the rest of the ignition. Oh, here's how this works. Here's a little adjuster that goes on the ignition switch, and then there is a threaded ring. This is kind of the beauty ring, and that'll screw on the outside, and that's what you'll actually see. So you'll kind of set this to be about halfway, and then this should screw down onto it, and then you back it off and then feed it up through there. So let's find a spot for this to live. I think it's going to go right up in here. So here's the hole for the governor control. That's where I'm going to mount the ignition switch. This is probably an old headlight switch. This feels momentary, so it's probably a horn. I don't know what this does. Maybe Somebody had electric wipers, who knows? One of these would be choke and the other one would have been hand throttle. This is the parking brake. This is another control switch. I don't know what that's for. And then over here is where the original ignition switch would be. And there's actually a coil and ignition switch component that would go behind there. Rather than try and track that archaic piece down, I'm just going to use some modern stuff. But what you would do is you would turn that on, and then you'd reach down here, and right there, that hole with the two little holes, there would be a push button that you would press down with your foot, and that would start the engine. So we're going to go right here, put the ignition in. Should be easy to reach. Here's a cool old turn signal switch. Doesn't move, but I don't want to force it. Maybe that could be revived at some point. Though this Flatfender only has turn signals up on the front. It only has one taillight on the rear. And I'm sure behind here there's all types of garbage wiring that we can remove at some point and clean up. But for now, we're just working on turning the thing on. I find that the trickiest part of wiring is routing the wires in a nice way so that they're tucked up and clean, figuring out where to go through. Like, for example, this Jeep has holes in the firewall over there, it has holes in the firewall in the middle, and it has holes in the firewall over here. My starter solenoid is here, my battery is here, my coil is here. So 3 of the things that my wires are going to hook up to are all right here. So I kind of feel like I can route the wires underneath the dash all the way to here and then poke them through, and then this will be where they all attach. So I don't need to run them out and then in the middle. But the coil is in the middle, so maybe it should be in the middle, but then there's supposed to be an air cleaner here, so I kind of like it over here. So this is like the questions that I look at. And I'm sure there is like the factory layout that you should be going by, but because I'm changing things, like I'm probably going to put a 12-volt alternator on, I'll probably lose this, I'll probably change my starter. Like, I'm just kind of messing with stuff and getting rid of stuff like this that is like a wire that is partially melted plus painted green when they painted everything. So I'm kind of trying to like clean all of this mess up and get it kind of buttoned up and prettier than it is now. So, yeah, that's the tricks of doing wiring, is trying to get it laid out in a way that you're not wasting a bunch of wire or having stuff looped up underneath. And then when you want to wire other things later, like gauges, headlights, the horn, they can all either work together, jive together, or they're completely separate, but they're not like getting all knotted up together. So take your time on wiring. It's frustrating, but it's really just, it takes time to just kind of like sort through it and decide where do I want stuff to live, and then wire it specifically for that. So it's just chipping away at it. Okay. What a bunch of mess. All right. You know what? I think we're gonna continue fixing this by cleaning up and getting rid of stuff that we're not using. Like this wire. And this is also one of my favorite parts, is when you kind of go through and you just like eliminate stuff that has been farmed onto the wiring harness over the years. Okay, this side has an enormous mess of wiring, but mostly it's headlights and horn. And so I'm not going to touch any more of that. This side has ignition and charging wires, and since I'm changing most of this, it can all get cut. All right, more garbage. Deleting the garbage. Cutting down these wires that are still here now, but are probably all going to go away. All right. Now, this is our speedometer cable. That wire all just got excommunicated. So maybe that's where it should come through. Because we'll have ignition. No, I think we'll keep it like in this area. Well, I don't know. Let's see. It could come out right there. Ooh, and then here's another wire, another hole. That one's not a bad spot. It had just a lot of holes in the firewall here. This one is our temperature gauge. This one is our speedometer. This one is our parking brake. So I have the wiring harness through the firewall. I actually went back and decided to put it through the firewall right here in the middle. And then I pulled this yellow wire out. This yellow wire is going to go to the coil. But before it goes to the coil, it's going to go to the ballast resistor, which is mounted up on the firewall. I also removed the ballast, or the coil, to show it to you. This one says, used with primary resistance wire or external resistor, 12 volts. So this is going to be used with the ballast resistor. I'm going to try and keep all this stuff straight in my head so that I don't say it wrong. Then on top of the coil, there is a plus and a minus. It's kind of right in there. And the positive side of the coil will hook to one side of the ballast resistor, and the other side of the ballast resistor will attach to the yellow wire that goes to the ignition terminal on the ignition switch. All right, that's down the road. We're not getting to that yet. What I think we should probably do next is put the starter back in, because I not only removed the starter, but I also removed the starter solenoid. This is the little switch that activates, sends big power from the battery out to the starter. Why did I remove this? Well, this one, as you see, has 3 terminals. There's battery positive in, battery positive out, and then this is where the signal is activated by the ignition switch. This goes to the start terminal on the key, and the wire, the green wire, will run to this, but I'm not going to use this one because it only has a single little terminal. I'm going to switch to this starter solenoid. And this starter solenoid, if you look really closely, on the top here it has 2 terminals and then 2 big terminals. And one of these little terminals has an S and the other little terminal has an I. So the S is where the starter signal comes from the key switch. The I is where an ignition wire will run to the coil, to the positive terminal of the coil. It's a little bit confusing, but the way it's going to work is you'll turn the key, battery power, well, let's start at the beginning. Positive power will run from the battery into the ignition switch. You'll turn the key all the way to start, and power will run to this terminal. And it will connect both of these terminals, sending power to the starter. Starter will spin. It'll also send power out this terminal straight to the coil. Then when the engine starts, you'll let go of the key and it'll go to the run, and there won't be power at either of these because it will be then running through the ballast resistor to the positive terminal of the coil. Why does all this stuff happen? Well, the way I understand it is the coil does not want 12 volts all the time. And as your engine revs up and your alternator speeds up and slows down, your voltage fluctuates. And the ballast resistor is kind of like a cushion for that. It kind of like keeps the voltage and current pretty constant. And I believe that constant current is right around 8 to 10 volts. But it likes having 12 volts when you start the vehicle. So when you start the vehicle is when this wire connects to this terminal and gives it a little boost. Like, hey, like you've been sitting, here's a little boost of energy to get a big spark and light the fuel and get you off and running. And then once you're running, you don't need that boost. Now we're gonna run through this ballast resistor and kind of give you some cool, simple 8 to 10 volts. That's the way I understand it. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not an automotive engineer. I'm just a guy with an old Jeep. So I do know that this needs a ballast resistor. Some of these do not need a ballast resistor, but it says right on here, use external resistor. So we have one on the firewall there. Both the external ballast resistor and the coil are used. So there's a possibility that either of these could be junk. But we're gonna set it up so that we use them as they are, and then we will replace them if something isn't working. So, new starter solenoid will replace the old starter solenoid down here on the fender. Oh, here's another thing. Starter solenoid is grounded through the base. So if for some reason this isn't working, you need to make sure that the fender is grounded. So that means all the body needs to be grounded, and we have a ground wire that runs to the engine block, but we also need to make sure that there is a ground wire running from the fender and body to the ground side of the battery or to the same spot on the engine block, so everything's happy. Basically, you need a ground strap. Keep all of the vehicle grounded. Otherwise, your lights won't work, your starting solenoid won't work, lots of stuff won't work. Check your grounds. So, next step is I'm going to install the starter solenoid on the fender. Then I am going to put the starter back on the engine. Then I can hook up the wires from the big wires that go from the starter solenoid to the starter and the starter solenoid to the battery. I'm not going to hook it up to the battery just yet. I'm just going to attach them all to this. Then we need a little signal wire to the starter solenoid, and we need an ignition wire from the I side of the starter solenoid to the positive side of the coil, bypassing the ballast resistor. So, and we haven't even gotten to the distributor cap or any of that stuff yet. So we're still just kind of laying it all out and trying to route it in such a way that it's easy to understand. Hopefully it's easy to understand. Oh, and like I said before, use colors of wires that are not the same so that you don't get things confused. Like, could you imagine right now if all of these were red wires? I'd be like, well, which one goes to the start and which one goes to the battery and which one goes to the fuse panel? All right, I know the blue one's a fuse and we haven't even gotten to that yet, so that can hang out over here. No, that's this one. This is the blue one. Okay, where was I? Mount starter solenoid to fender. It's really pretty simple. I mean, there's no computers, there's no nothing. It's just 12 volts. It's just got to go to certain places at certain times. Everything's coming together. My negative terminal battery cable had a little pigtail, has a little pigtail thing, and I extended that and I put it between the starter solenoid mount and the fender to make sure there's a good ground on the starter solenoid. Then I put the starter back in and I hooked up the lead from the starter solenoid up to the starter. Then I hooked up the positive cable up to the other big lead on the starter solenoid. And then I put this green wire, the signal wire for the starter, onto the starter terminal on the starter solenoid. So we're getting close. What's next? This blue wire is going to go to a fuse panel. It's going to run anything that's fused for when the key is in the run position. I don't want to have a whole bunch of wires running underneath the dash to the ignition switch. I'm going to put a fuse panel. And I think this is my external voltage regulator for my old alternator or generator. I think all that stuff's going to go away. So I think my next step is to remove this voltage regulator and find some sort of little fuse panel that can go right here. I don't know if I can find that in town. I might have to order that. But that will be the plan for a fuse panel. I may get that on today, I may not. That may be something I have to wait till another time if I have to order it online. These yellow wires that are here, those are left over from that earlier push button switch, and I could probably put that back on. I also need to figure out this big red wire. This red wire is what's feeding my ignition switch, and then it's feeding the run side of the fuse panel. I'm looking for actually a two-sided fuse panel. One side will be full-time power, so that's like your headlights, brake lights, things that you can turn on at any time. And then the other side would be keyed run power, and that would be this blue wire, and that would be things like gauges. Wiring's fun. It's just kind of like a puzzle. You like chip away at this piece and that piece. People get really frustrated by wiring. But man, especially when it's a Flatfender, I mean, there's like a dozen wires, which seems like a lot, but it really isn't compared to, like, you look under the hood of a new car, new Jeep, new anything. All right, let's wire up, well, let's go look for a fuse panel, and I think I need to buy some more little connectors. I'm not using anything special, fancy as far as connectors. I have one, I stripped the wire, I put on one that crimps and shrink wraps, and then I actually usually slide a second piece of shrink wrap over it. I don't solder. I feel like that's a lot more work than I want to do. And it's like, I feel like I've had good luck with the little crimps and the double shrink wrap because it seems to hold it all together pretty good. But I'm sure somewhere there's an aircraft wiring engineer that's rolling his eyes at me for just using basic crimp connectors on my 46 Jeep. All right, let's go find some more stuff. I ran to town, I got some more stuff. I got some more little crimps. I have some more shrink wrap. And then I looked for a fuse panel. I couldn't find one, which didn't surprise me. So I'll probably have to order one online. But I did find this inline fuse. This is a big fuse, and it will protect the ignition switch and everything that runs off of the ignition switch. And it is powered by this wire that runs to the positive side of the starter solenoid. My goal is to have anything that is getting power from the positive side of the battery to not be running directly to the battery. Kind of always bums me out when I have a battery terminal with a whole bunch of wires running to it. Makes it difficult to remove the battery because you have all this stuff going to it. I don't know if the starter solenoid terminal is the best place to have everything run to, but the only other thing that would be running off of it will be a fuse panel that will mount here on the fender. I do have this blue wire that will run the keyed side of the fuse panel, and I don't have the fuse panel yet, so I'm just going to wrap this up with a zip tie and zip tie it up out of the way for now. These two yellow wires are for this push button switch on the firewall, and I will probably hook those back up so that I can crank over the engine from inside the engine bay instead of having to go around to the driver's side to turn on the key. I removed the voltage regulator and I need to remove the generator, but otherwise we're moving right along on getting everything together. Let's talk about ballast resistors. This is the ballast resistor that was mounted on the firewall. And the ballast resistor is this kind of fragile ceramic piece that has a wire that comes in and another wire that comes out. And inside here, it makes resistance, which reduces the voltage under current to the coil. These they make heat. When they make resistance, they make heat. So you don't want them mounted somewhere that they could cause a fire, like on fabric, carpet. Just keep it away from that sort of thing. They usually mount to the firewall. This one was mounted with a metal screw that ran through it into the firewall. I hate screws on cars because that usually results in like a sharp pointy end somewhere hidden, either behind a fender to stab into a tire, or underneath the firewall, or behind the firewall to stab into your arm or stab into some wires. So the first thing I did was I replaced this with a bolt, a 5/16 bolt that runs through the firewall, and then I put a metal locking nut on it to hold it in place. So it's basically now there's a stud sticking out of the firewall that I can slide this onto, and then it'll hold on with a nut. Second, ballast resistors are notorious for failing, so I ran down to my local auto parts store and I bought another one. I want to say this was 10 or 15 bucks. Should I run the original one, or should I run the new one? Or should I put the new one on and put the original one in the box and put it in the glove box or the toolbox as a spare? Good question. We'll figure that out as we get to it. Now, not all coils need a ballast resistor. This one does. I got a replacement for this that also does. And the argument is if you don't have a ballast resistor, the heat from the ballast resistor is now internal on the coil, and coils don't like heat. So some people say, just put in a coil that has an internal resistor, it's less wires. Other people say, you're gonna reduce the life of your coil if it has an internal ballast resistor because you're putting more heat in the coil. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I like to keep things simple with less wires, but I've kind of already headed down the road of the ballast resistor and the coil that uses an external resistor, so that's what we're gonna stick to. I replaced this. I got another one of these. Again, do I keep the original coil that was in the Jeep, or do I put the new one on and put the original one in the toolbox? That's to be determined. I opted for the old parts. I hooked up the yellow wire and the orange wire to the ballast resistor. I put the coil back in and I ran the orange wire from the ballast resistor down to the coil. Now, this orange wire goes over to the ignition port on the starter solenoid, but it also attaches to the ballast resistor. So if you remember, when you crank the key to start, it sends 12 volts directly to the coil, but when you set it to run, it sends 12 volts to the ballast resistor, and then it comes out to the coil. So it looks kind of funky, but that's how it works. Now, how does the coil work? Well, the coil actually has 3 terminals. There's a positive terminal, a negative terminal, and then deep inside here is the terminal that plugs into the spark plug wire. It's actually the coil wire that runs from the coil, top of the coil, over to the distributor cap. And what happens, again, not an electrical engineer, but I will explain it the way I understand it. There is a coil of wires around the outside of the coil, all inside here, and then there's a coil of wire on the inside. And the voltage runs around that outer side, and then because there's this gap between these 2 coils of wire, it makes an electrical field, or a magnetic field, or maybe it's an electromagnetic field. And what happens is when the current is broken on the outer coil of wires, the inner coil of wires gets this really high voltage. So if there's 12 volts running around the outside, when that current is broken, when it's stopped, the inside will get somewhere between 15 and 40,000 volts. Why do you need that much voltage? Well, you want that much voltage at the inner because that's what goes to your distributor cap, and then that is dispersed to your spark plugs, and your spark plugs have that little gap at the bottom of them, and you want that voltage to jump that gap, and that causes the spark, which burns the fuel-air mixture, which causes the explosion, which makes the internal combustion inside the cylinder, which turns everything, and your Jeep goes happily bouncing down the trail. So, the negative side of the coil, which is where we're at now, needs to be attached to the distributor, and inside the distributor are the points. And the way the points work is when they are closed, that voltage is running all the way around the coil. And then when the points open, it breaks that current. So then it goes, stops flowing, and that magnetic field collapses. The internal wire gets 40,000 volts, give or take, and that goes into your spark plug, and bam. So your points are inside the distributor, and they are closed, open. And when they open, that voltage goes, and it shoots power to whichever spark plug your distributor cap rotor is pointing towards. So, and it opens 4 times because there's 4 cylinders. If this was a V6 or a straight 6, it would open 6 times. If it was a V8, it would open 8 times. And that's just for the most basic version. So this rotor is spinning inside there. There's like this weird square-shaped peg, and each corner pushes open the points. The electrical current flowing through around the outside of your coil collapses, stops flowing, so that magnetic field collapses, 40,000 volts, give or take, comes through your coil wire to the center of your distributor cap, and the distributor rotor is spinning around the same way that square peg is spinning around, and it says, hey, cylinder number 1, you get the voltage. So then it shoots out the spark plug wire to cylinder number 1 and jumps the gap on the spark plug, exploding the fuel, and we are making internal combustion energy. So next step is we need to attach this little wire. This was the old one, which was kind of junky, and it probably would have worked, but I made this nice pretty new one. So I'm going to install this, and man, we are getting really close to being able to crank this over. Positive terminal on the battery runs to the starter solenoid. From the starter solenoid, we have a big red wire that runs through a fuse up to the ignition switch. From the ignition switch, coming back, we have a green wire that runs to the starter solenoid, a yellow wire that runs to one side of the ballast resistor, and a blue wire which will later run a fuse panel. Also on the starter solenoid, we have an orange wire that runs over to the opposite side of the ballast resistor and links down to the positive terminal on the coil. On the negative terminal of the coil, we have a black wire that runs down to the distributor cap, and on the opposite side of the starter solenoid, we have a big red wire that runs to the starter. So everything seems to be pretty well figured out. There is a ground wire running from the bolt that bolts the starter solenoid to the fender up to the negative battery cable, which is not hooked up just yet because I want to make sure everything's figured out. I think the next step is let's look under the cap on the distributor. This is our distributor. The middle plug is what's going to go to the top of the coil right here. And then inside the distributor, if I reach down here on either side, you can unclip this. Oh, then there's 4 plug wires that are all the way around the exterior of the distributor, and they go in a specific order, which is the firing order. So this is our rotor, and this spins around as the engine cranks. And then underneath the rotor, there is the arm that has the points. And then if you look at the rotor, not at the rotor itself, but as at the middle of the distributor, you can see that this is kind of square shaped. So this goes right here. Now, if you look inside the distributor cap, this one has a bunch of cobwebs and a spider, maybe a dead spider. Yep, looks pretty dead. You don't want that. You want that all cleaned out. But the nice thing is that it doesn't have any corrosion. We'll grab our air hose. and blow all those spider webs out of there. Now you can see these, there's a kind of a copper brass fitting right there in the middle, and then 4 more. As this rotor spins, it connects to this and it transmits power to each of these. And each one of these corresponds with a spark plug, as you can see. Blow all of that out too, because there looked like there were some spider webs in there. There's that. You can see how that's kind of square shaped. As that turns, it pushes that little arm right there, and that opens up the points right there at the end of my fingernail. And this has a very specific shape, so it only fits on that one way. So we want the rotor to point at the corresponding plug when that cylinder is at top dead center on its compression stroke. So how do we find that? I'm ready to put the distributor cap back on, but I want to figure out the number 1 spark plug wire. So how do I do that? Well, I want the spark plug to fire when the number 1 cylinder is at top dead center on its compression stroke. So I found this little cork, and I'm going to screw this into the top of the block right where the spark plug goes. Then I hooked up that momentary switch that we had before, that push button, that will just crank over the engine. And when it does that, everything will turn and I can watch the rotor rotate around, which would be inside of the distributor cap. So in theory, as I bump this around, when that thing shoots off into the air, that means it is right at or has just passed top dead center for the number 1 spark plug. And then we can put this on and we'll know like which plug it should be pointing at. So we have that screwed in. Now we just watch for it to launch up into the air. There it goes. So that looks like this plug wire right here. In fact, I'm just going to remove it. That should be the number 1 spark plug. I'm going to do this again so that you can see it closely. Screw in the cork. Bump the key. All right. After the cork shot out, I came down in here, and this is where you try to watch for the timing. There's a line that should line up with those 2 marks on either side of that little hole. This is back underneath the starter. I was having a hard time seeing it, so I removed the starter and I turned the flywheel until I found the timing marks. And I marked them with paint. The red paint just tells you that you're getting close, and then the white paint is top center. Above that is an ignition line, above that is intake open. Now I can crank the engine over, and when I see the red dot coming up to this hole, I know that I'm getting really close, and then I can slowly bring it up so the white line is in line with those 2 marks on the bell housing. Okay, our timing mark is lined up with the marks on the bell housing. And then when we come up here, we can see where our distributor is sitting. And so with that being the number 1 area, we're going to put this guy right here. And that means that this bottom one by my thumb is going to be our number 1 spark plug wire. So now that I have this all figured out, I can put all the spark plugs back in, and I can start hooking up the spark plug wires. Now, the firing order on this Jeep is 1, 3, 4, 2. So it starts with number 1, then it goes to number 3, then it goes to number 4, then it goes to number 2, and it goes back to number 1. And you're going to put the matching spark plug wires in so that as the rotor spins, and the rotor spins counterclockwise, it'll go 1, 3, 4, 2, 1, 3, 4, 2. Spark plugs are all hooked up. Now I took the starter out to find those timing marks. So I'm going to put the starter back in. Oh, and we have to hook up that coil wire, this guy. So that plugs in here to the top of the coil. I want to explain one more thing so that it doesn't confuse you. I didn't explain it when I was doing this. That timing mark that I put on the flywheel is going to come around twice. And one of those times will be top dead center for compression, and one of those times will be top dead center for exhaust. So if it shows up and like if you do the thing with the cork and you crank it over and the cork shoots out and you see where the rotor is pointed, and then you verify with the top dead center mark, you should be good. If you turn the engine until you see the top dead center mark and the rotor is 180 degrees out in the distributor from where it was when the cork shot out, you're probably on your exhaust stroke and not on your compression stroke. Engines have, well, this engine, 4 strokes. It has the upstroke of compressing the air, the downstroke of the power, that's what drives the engine, the upstroke of the pushing out of the exhaust, and the downstroke of pulling in fresh air. And then it goes right back to the upstroke of compression. So that upstroke of compression is your top dead center, down is power, upstroke to exhaust is where it's pushing out the exhaust, but that also goes to top dead center. But there won't be the compression. It won't shoot the cork into the air. So basically, if something feels wrong, you might just have your wires 180 degrees out or your whole distributor 180 degrees out. I don't know if that made it more sense or more confusing. All right, let's see if we have spark. How are we going to test for spark? I'm going to use this. This is a spark plug tester. Now, you can do a couple things. You can pull the spark plug wire off of the end of the spark plug, put a screwdriver in it, ground the screwdriver, and have somebody crank over the engine and watch for spark or get shocked. Another thing you can do is remove the spark plug itself, hold it against a ground part of the engine, crank it over, watch for spark, and get shocked. I am fine with getting shocked, but I don't have anybody here to crank over the engine. So I'm going to use this gadget, which should light up inside here when it's getting spark. Before I do that, though, I'm going to test the key. Let's reach in here, turn the key, and see if the engine rotates. Now remember, make sure your Jeep is in neutral. It seems like a pretty obvious thing. I know there's young kids that watch this, or old kids, and I also know that there are people with a lot of experience who have run themselves over because they forgot that they left the Jeep in gear and it lurched forward and ran over their leg, or worse. So make sure your Jeep is in neutral when you crank it over. And turn the key. Look at that! Excellent. That means that the starter solenoid is working. It's getting power to the starter and the key ignition is working. Now, are we getting spark? Is the ignition system working? Well, let's plug this guy in. I'm going to remove number 1. Put that boot on there. Put this thing on here. I really want to see that. I'm going to shut all the lights off, or at least a lot of the lights, at least this light. And maybe this light. Okay, everybody, moment of truth. Watch right here. Let's go, Sparky. We're not getting any spark. Why are we not getting any spark? Everything is failing. The camera is overheating. The ballast resistor just broke off of the firewall. The coil doesn't seem to be working, and the starter solenoid doesn't seem to be sending 12 volts through the orange wire to the far side of the ballast resistor. So, I really wanted there to be spark, and it seems like everything that I have touched is not working. So we are going to, I guess we will replace the ballast resistor, we'll replace this coil, and we'll go see if we can find a different starter solenoid. And then we will see if we have spark. Cars are fun. Look at that. That thing just broke. Pulled the coil out. We'll put this new one in. And I don't know why this thing's not working, but I'm going to disconnect everything and test it. The ignition project kind of snowballed. I tried to get spark. I was not seeing any spark. Then my starter solenoid was not clicking. And then I figured out that the starter itself was not working. So I broke the cardinal rule of project vehicles. I robbed Peter to pay Paul. I stole the starter that I had on the shelf for another Flatfender project. But I haven't been working on that other Flatfender project at all, so I don't feel too bad about it, and I can get this one rebuilt or find another one for that other one. So I put a brand new starter on. I swapped out the starter solenoid. I think the starter may have locked up and overheated the solenoid, and that's why it wasn't getting power to the coil. It has a new coil now. I also got inside this distributor, and I replaced the points and I replaced the condenser. And I did that, and I kind of did some research on this distributor. It turns out this is probably not the right distributor for this Jeep. In fact, one theory is that this is for a tractor, and it just happens to work on this little Go Devil engine. The funny thing about this distributor, if you look inside here, right down here underneath the points, the connecting straps for the points and the spring for those points, they're so close to the body of the distributor that they look like they're going to ground out, and somebody put a piece of electrical tape in there. Right down in there, you can see that piece of electrical tape. That probably shouldn't be there. Those little, so the power comes in here, and then runs up these little metal straps into the points, and then when this rotates, the points open and close. And those little metal straps, you can just see at the end of my fingernail, should not touch the outside body of the distributor or they'll ground out. This is what those little metal straps look like. This is the old points. Also, these points can be sanded and still reused. I just replaced them because I was kind of in a mode of replacing everything else. There's the other parts of the points. So those could be sanded and put back in or saved. So I replaced the electrical tape with fresh electrical tape, but it really shouldn't be that way. I don't know if these are the wrong points for this distributor, or if it's just a bad design, or if like the insulator washers where the bolt runs through the side of the distributor are bad and everything's, all I know is that I put it back to the way it is to try and nurse this one along, because if we can't make it work, then we probably won't replace it with the same style. We'll probably get the proper Go Devil distributor. The other thing that's ironic, funny, or dumb, is that most of the time when you do a tune-up, you replace the spark plugs, the spark plug wires, the cap, and rotor. I replaced the spark plugs, but all the cap, rotor, and spark plug wires are the same ones that were on the Jeep. But, I mean, A, they look nice and new, but B, it's kind of dumb that I didn't replace those and I replaced so much other stuff around it. Battery, starter solenoid, starter, battery cables, all the wiring, coil, ballast resistor, points, and condenser. So basically I touched just about everything. Oh, and spark plugs. So basically I touched just about everything except for the parts that you normally change. That being said, if this isn't the right distributor, then I probably won't replace these parts for it. I'll probably try and get the right distributor, and it'll probably come with all new parts. So, oh, and timing. I needed to rotate the distributor in order to get the timing just right. The idea is that instead of the top dead center mark, you want to go one mark up above that where it says ignition on the flywheel. And when I got that lined up, then it's right when it's there is where the points should just start to open. And in order to do that, I couldn't rotate the distributor, so I had to kind of pry it out because it had kind of seized into the sleeve of the engine, and now it works perfectly. Now it moves around nice and smooth, but basically everything was kind of rotten and old and junky, and I replaced a whole bunch of stuff, and hopefully now we can shut off the lights and see some spark. Moment of truth. Watch right here. There is our tester for our spark. Again, don't forget to make sure it's in neutral. Battery's hooked up. Nothing. All right, let's go for it. Did you see it? Come closer. Cranking. Yes. We did it. We have spark. We don't know if it's timed right, but we have spark at the spark plug. I should wrap this episode up. It's getting really long. And you guys probably have more important things to do, but I'm gonna dump some gas down this thing and hook up this spark plug and see if it makes engine noises. It wants to. Come on, little Jeep. Woohoo! That's it for this Dirt Daily. The little Jeep made engine noises. Next time, we'll try to actually make it run like it's supposed to. Hook up all the fuel and all that garbage. Woohoo! That's it for this Dirt Daily. We'll see you guys next time. That's awesome.